Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Great pleasure to have a chance to talk to Colin Renfrew, who I've known for many years and sat on many exciting faculty boards with. Colin, tell me first of all where and when you were born.
I was born in 1937 on the 25th of July in Stockton-upon-Tees, and that's where my father was at that time working. He was in ICI Plastics, so he was working near there. And I don't have any great recollection of that because we moved south when I was 3 or 4 down to Welwyn Garden City. So that's where I really grew up while he was working at ICI Plastics there.
Let's go back. Some people like to go back at least to grandparents who have influenced them, or even back to the Tudors and Stuarts, but how far back would you like to go? Is there anything to say about your ancestors?
I can't go very far back because I never knew either grandfather. They both died before I was born. So I certainly have fond memories of my grandmother, my father's mother, who lived in Giffnock near Glasgow. So I went up there for holidays on many occasions, and so I've got very happy memories of travelling on the tram, because those days that was the way you travelled in Glasgow, and trams to a little boy are very impressive enterprises. So I have happy memories of the trams in Glasgow and meeting some relatives there. And then my mother's mother lived in Ardrossan with another daughter of hers, and so I had many happy holidays in Ardrossan, which of course has got a very nice seashore, and we sometimes went across to the island of Arran, which is where both my parents had had many holidays, and obviously a very beautiful island with good walking and good megalithic monuments, as it turned out. So I have very happy memories of Scotland. I still have quite a number of relatives on my mother's side. That was a large family, although she and all her contemporaries have died now, and I don't really see very much of most of my cousins, so I still see 1 or 2 of them.
Is the name Renfrew sounds like Renfrewshire. Is there any connection?
It is related, yes. I tried to do a bit of genealogy and went sort of back through the generations for a couple of 100 years. And the families from the Paisley area, which of course is in Renfrewshire, so I'm not sure exactly why the term, of course, Renfrew is a location, it's a city, so they're obvious, but it's not a very common family name. It exists in Scotland and also in Canada and North America because emigration. I believe Renfrew of the Mounties was a very popular television program in the 40s and 50s, though I never saw very much of it. That's what the association is, and I've pleasant memories of my 2 great aunts who live near Paisley, and that's about as far as I've been able to trace it.
Tell me something about your parents and the way they might have influenced you.
Well, my father was a very energetic person mentally, with a wide range of interests and a very nice sense of humour, very gregarious, for instance, he was very interested in languages, which certainly I think interested me. Whenever he travelled, he would sort of take a phrase book and try and learn some of the language, so he got to be able to get around in Spanish and Italian and so on. And my mother was also enthusiastic for that, so that they encouraged me, once we'd been to the continent a couple of times. Before I did my national service, I thought it would be a good idea to go and learn some more French, and went to stay in Paris with a family, which they very warmly supported. And then I did that immediately afterwards, because as you know, national service was 2 years and the timing worked out right. And so I had some very happy sojourns in Paris, and that was really, I think, because of my father's interest and my mother's enthusiasm also. He was very encouraging, as they both were, of my sort of developing interests during the war years, when there was no petrol to travel by car or anything. We used to go off, my father and I, for a trip on a bicycle, visiting parish churches. And we both liked the atmosphere. We weren't particularly
This was in Hertfordshire.
Hertfordshire, yes, around from out of Welwyn Garden City. Sort of 10 or 15 miles, a lot of parish churches within that radius. And that was, I have really very happy memories of doing that, and I think he did that actively to spend some time with me, which I valued. And I think probably something of the atmosphere of churches and these nice bits of architecture and so on probably stayed with me from that time. He also used to take me occasionally, when we were in London, he would sort of drag me into the National Gallery, but I was quite a small boy then, and would begin to get impatient. But maybe that experience made it seem natural to go into the National Gallery myself when I felt a bit more inclined to look seriously at the pictures.
He didn't take you to the British Museum and look at objects?
I think, oh yes, I don't think with any great intention of looking at particular objects, but he was a person of great curiosity, and certainly I visited the British Museum several times as quite a small boy, and remember, not surprisingly, looking at the mummies and so on, which would be the first point of attention, I suppose, for a small boy. So I'm sure those things helped to set up interests which developed later.
Did you have any particular, we're talking sort of in your 5, 6, 7 years old, do you have any particular hobbies or interests by that time?
Yes, I started at quite early on, I wouldn't know what age, but 5 or 6 or something, collecting coins. And I first of all was collecting coins from change, because in those days, as you'll remember, you got Victorian coins, you got button pennies, the young head of Queen Victoria, as well as the old head, and all kinds of things in change. And then I suppose I was soon collecting a few Roman coins, and it must have, I think, have been my father's encouragement that he took me, he must have looked up who was the leading coin dealer in London, and that was Baldwin's, and so they were very welcome. I must have been just 7 or 8, and showed me some coins, and my father bought me 1 or 2, and I started to collect coins quite seriously then, in a schoolboyish way, and of course a wide range of foreign coins. And then I really became quite an intensive collector, and after we'd visited Etruria on our first trip overseas, which was when I was 12, then it seemed natural to start trying to collect Etruscan coins, and I subscribed to the coin bulletin. Seabees had a coin bulletin, and Spinks had a numismatic circular, being slightly higher up market, so I would sort of choose things that looked interesting, and if I got a birthday or a Christmas present coming, would suggest this or that might be appropriate. And so over the years I built up quite a good collection of Etruscan coins, and then I got interested also in coins of the Civil War, the English Civil War, which are really very rare, but Newark sixpences and so on, or shillings, were available, and those became very special presents, and so I do have some interesting coins, although I really stopped. I never was a serious numismatist in the sense of being in a scholarly way. I've got a friend, Ian Stewart, now Lord Stuartby, who, when he was a schoolboy, was writing books on the Scottish coinage, and a real scholar. Well, I was never a scholar in that direction at all. But I really couldn't afford to buy good coins, were getting more and more expensive once I was into my 20s. And then, more recently, I've become more puristic about the matter because more recently I realized how collecting antiquities really does serious damage to the archaeological record. And though I don't think collecting coins is as serious as collecting artifacts that have very clearly been looted from the ground, I've now made such sort of puristic statements that it would now be inappropriate for me to buy any more.
The police raided your house and found your collection.
Well, I've also got one or two antiquities that I bought. I bought a very beautiful Ushabti figure, one of the Egyptian figures that were buried with the dead. I think when I was excavating in Canterbury, the age of about 16, I used to go around the antique shops and saw this beautiful Ushabti figure and bought it for about 10 shillings. So that is still on a mantelpiece at home.
Remember, this is going out to the world, Colin.
This was well before I was 60. If I was 16, this would be in 1953, well before the 1970 UNESCO Convention was published. So I think I can confess this small sin to the world.
But so you still continue your coin collecting, or it's more or less stopped?
No, I don't collect coins anymore. There's a whole story about the problems that numismatists have to stay within what is ethical, and I have a lot of sympathy with some of the things they say, but having been so dogmatic to the point of sanctimony, perhaps, on the ills of collecting, I think there is still a place for collecting, but I think it's simplest if I don't collect antiquities. And more recently, I've come to regard coins as broadly lying in that field. So I still have my collection. In fact, it's time I sold it, and I don't know how I do that elegantly without attracting disapprobation, but that's another problem.
Okay, well, the only thing left with the early part is really your mother's character. I mean, was she a reader? Did she have a job? Or
no, she simply ran the house.
That was just you and siblings? Or?
Unfortunately, no, I didn't have any siblings. I believe my mother had a daughter who died at birth or something a couple of years before I was born. So I, in practice, never had any siblings. She was a delightful person and very interested, but not in the same energetic way as my father, who was a great reader. My mother read a little, but not so much. But she had her own interests. We had very good friends in Welwyn Garden City, family friends, Ted and Renee Power, and they were contemporaries of my parents, and he formed a wonderful collection of contemporary art. He, a self-made man, he'd made his money in Murphy Radio, which was a great enterprise at the time. And when he sold up, he was, as I say, a wealthy man, and he was way ahead of his time in collecting contemporary art. So he had works by Jackson Pollock and Mark Rothko and so on in his house in Welwyn Garden City in the late 50s and early 60s, which I got to know. And his wife, Renee, and my mother were great friends, so they would go to London sometimes and visit galleries and so on. So my mother did have many interests, but perhaps not quite in the same vigorous way as my father.
What was the first school that you went to?
First school I went to was in Welwyn Garden City, Sherrod's Wood School, which was very close to us, within easy walking distance. And it was a well-run school. It had, or tried to have, slightly modern ideas about education, though I couldn't really set out their philosophy, but they clearly did have such ideas. But I think, as can happen, the academic standards were not terrifically high, so although I was happy there, it was my mother, I think, who said to my father that I ought to be going to somewhere a bit more demanding, and so they suggested that to me, and I didn't particularly disagree, and so they put me down for the common entrance, or whatever you called it, for St Albans School, which St Albans 7 or 8 miles away from Welwyn Garden City, so it was a bus ride, and I got a scholarship there. In those days they weren't means tested. I don't think my father was reasonably well off, well paid at ICI, but anyway I got my bus pass and my scholarship and went to St Albans School, which certainly I think was much more academically oriented, maybe in that sense less modern than Sherrers Wood, but had a terrific group of schoolmasters, many of whom I still remember with great fondness, and a very good group of people in the same class, one or two of whom I still keep up with, so that was really good. They really sparked interest. The English master was very enthusiastic about poetry in a way that was wasn't him spouting.
What was his name?
Macfarlane.
Macfarlane.
And he was just got us all reading and taking part in readings from Shakespeare and so on, but in a way that he wasn't telling us. We were in the end doing a great deal of the work, and one had to sit for English O-level then, one had to do some set books, so it was a wonderful way of getting to know Shakespeare well, to do a Shakespeare play in real detail. This was Twelfth Night, and so I think it's a marvellous benefit to be able to go to any play by Shakespeare and not find it complicated because one has heard a little of the language, and Chaucer also, and then had a very encouraging Latin master. I never found the Latin very interesting, but he was a very nice man who arranged for me to go on my first excavation. And then the
what was his
he was Coles.
Coles.
Yes. And then Mr. Tanner, Bob Tanner, the art master, was sympathetic that I didn't seem to have much competence at drawing or painting, but was very interested in the books that he had in his collection. So I got to know, some of the Renaissance masters a little bit from these books quite early on, that was when I began to take an interest in art, and when I began to enjoy visits to the National Gallery or whatever. And then the physics master, Geoffrey Pryke, was also a great amateur acting person, and so he arranged dramatic performances, not so much in school, others did that, but out of school, and I took part in some of those. And so there were just lots of extracurricular activity. I was never a very good sports person, never enjoyed cricket or rugby or whatever, but there were lots of other things happening at the school that did involve one. And also St Albans School occupies the Abbey Gateway of St Albans Cathedral, and the services, we had hall every day, but twice a week there was a service in St Albans Cathedral, and I got in the school choir, as many people did, and came to enjoy that very much. Carol services in the cathedral and so on really were a good experience.
Moving on along music, I mean, has music meant a lot to you through your life, and what kind of music?
I do enjoy music. I did learn piano a little, but never really got through a barrier as to enjoying playing very much. So I never played effectively. I've enjoyed singing and did sing in Jesus College with the choir there sometimes. And I very much remember my first participation in something serious was while I was still at Sherrers Wood School, therefore I was about age 10, which was St John's Passion, which by Bach, which was
very ambitious for a 10-year-old.
Well, I was only I was only taking part with the other trebles in the treble line, so I don't think that was particularly ambitious. And I did come to enjoy listening to music. And Geoffrey Pryke again used to take school visits to all kinds of orchestral productions in London and elsewhere. So I do enjoy classical music, but I've never been a great exponent, and I've got to be more interested in the theatre than in going to a concert. And so while I had the chance later, I was very often going to see what was on at the theatre in London.
What about listening? Some people find that their work is done better, well, writing or whatever it is, accompanied by music, or they are inspired by music too.
I don't do that. I just blaze away while I'm working, and I know some people. I've got friends, painters, who love to listen while they're painting and so on. And so I've not really listened a huge. I mean, I listen occasionally, but music doesn't play a central role in my life, even though I think I do find it very moving and enjoy it very much. But sometimes I think it's more exciting to go and see a play where the drama is unfolding before you, as it were.
Later on we'll come to politics probably, but were there any signs of your interest in politics present at St Albans? I mean, did you?
Not to any very great point. We were all, a lot of us were argumentative and liked talking, and I suppose liked hearing our own voices. And certainly there was a debating society which I enjoyed taking part in, and was probably good training. But I didn't get more seriously involved in politics till I got up to university, really. And that also there related with debating also.
In St Albans, the only other old boy I can recall just at the moment is my former beloved Professor Jack Goody. I mean, to produce two such eminent Arcanant's people seems to suggest it was a very good school, and there are presumably
it was,
others.
and I think is a good school. Jack, of course, was a little beyond me, so I didn't know Jack at all at St Albans. And another, and perhaps more celebrated Albanian, younger than me and therefore younger than Jack, is Stephen Hawking.
Ah.
But an exact contemporary of mine, whom you might know, is Joe Cann, who was a fellow of St John's for a while, and then went on to be professor elsewhere, who is a geologist, a very distinguished geologist. And so we were in the same class at school. Indeed, also in the same class for a while before he moved elsewhere was Ansel Dunham, who was another geologist. He died rather young, unfortunately, but was a distinguished geologist.
So some very interesting, distinguished people. The other thing that often happens towards the end of one's teenage years is that one either takes to or against religion, organised religion. Presumably you were singing in the choir in St Albans Abbey and so on. You were an Anglican at that time.
Yes, I was baptised into the Church of England, never confirmed. I never sort of felt an urge to be confirmed, and nobody particularly encouraged me to be confirmed. There was no great pressure in the school, there were certainly possibilities. And neither of my parents, I think, was very sort of actively inclined towards the divinity. I certainly was interested. I remember from being the age of 8 or 9 having sort of asking questions, which ultimately were philosophical questions. I had an uncle whom I liked very well, my Uncle George, who was a Catholic and quite clear about being a Catholic, and I used to ask him questions about things I didn't understand, and was never very satisfied by the answers. So I think I've always had a sceptical streak about anything, really, and I think my scepticism developed while I was at school, so I've never found it possible to be a profound believer in the Trinity or in the Christian, whether Anglican or Catholic, concept of God and Christ and so on. It's a fascinating story, and I certainly find many beautiful things in a church service on some occasions, so I haven't got provoked into the position of some as to sort of excoriate all religious thinking and activity, but the central concept that this explains things, because I think my approach has always been to try and understand how things work. I went up to university to do natural sciences originally and was interested in a lot of those interesting questions which the sciences can help you think about. And I really never found that the concept of the divinity helped to answer any of those questions.
And did you ever find, as master of a college which had previously been a Benedictine nunnery or whatever Jesus was, that being presiding over religious rituals, to a certain extent, not presiding, but certainly being caused any dissonance or worry?
I didn't. It may be that if I'd undertaken a more rigorous analysis, one might have found some inconsistencies. Indeed, I think when you read that there is an inconsistency in pronouncing the words of the Apostles' Creed, when I can't really say that I utter those words with a full and devout heart, as it were. But it's conventionally, in a college like Jesus College, as you very well know, the role of the master to be present at particularly on Sunday services, and perhaps to take the preacher into dinner in hall afterwards. I know there are a lot of different devices. I remember in St John's, I think Harry Hinsley, as I recall, wouldn't go into the service, but would always devoutly take the preacher into dinner and manage to reach an adjustment, I presume, in that way. But one thing, of course, in Jesus, as indeed in St John's, is that the choral music is very good. There's a great choral tradition in Jesus College, and I would sometimes go in, quite apart from the obligation, which it is, obviously, if one had a strong moral objection, one could say, I'm not going to do this, and the world wouldn't come to an end. But I would quite often go in during the week just to hear the sung evensong, which of course is a much shorter service, and avoids being obliged to listen to a sermon of variable quality, and I used to enjoy it. And indeed, I haven't, because I've been very busy, I haven't been doing that recently now that I no longer live in college, but I can certainly imagine myself popping in from time to time to enjoy choral evensong. So I was never hostile to the work of the chapel, partly because I very much respected the people involved, the chaplains, and they undoubtedly do good works there. But I've never really done a great census of whether the church has been a good thing or a bad thing in the history of the world. I really haven't pronounced on that, and probably better not doing so.
Okay, well let's now go on to university. Although you mentioned that you went on to do natural sciences, had you been good at sciences at St Albans?
Yes, and I've partly because I found these general questions range: what were the origins of the world, the origin of the universe, what was the nature of life, and so on. These questions, which are obviously fascinating questions for us all, they were very much questions where advances were being made in the 50s, as well as subsequently. And there used to be a very nice, I think, Penguin or Pelican publication, science, sort of annually, sort of science roundup, where some of these issues in scientific progress were addressed. And I must say I found some of the teaching in the humanities a little woolly. I didn't really see what was the point in learning more about the history of the Tudors. I didn't really find that very engaging, whereas to be being introduced to and understanding the laws of physics through experiment. I had a very good teacher, Mr. Marshall, who was very rigorous. He would write his his explanations on the note on the board. But if there was something you didn't understand and said, "Can that be right?" or "Excuse me, could you explain that?" he felt it his obligation to make that clear. And if there was something wasn't quite clear in his mind, he would go away and clarify it. And I very much like the clarity and the rigour of physics, and to some extent, a lesser extent, the other sciences. So yes, I was quite good at that, although I think I was good enough at the arts subjects also. The headmaster, Mr. Marsh, had encouraged me warmly to do the humanities, and sort of advised my parents that he thought I would be well suited. He was himself a classicist, so he had his own penchant. And indeed, he wrote on my school report, I think, the year the sixth form began and you made the definitive choice to the son, he wrote "Qualis artifex perdio," which you know were Nero's last words.
Really?
I think, yes. But what an artist dies with me was, I believe, Nero's last words. So I remember his putting that on the report form. But anyway, it was a wonderful course in Cambridge because, as you know, the natural sciences tripos requires you to do quite a mix of subjects. So I did mathematics and an additional half subject of mathematics and physics and chemistry and a half subject biochemistry and a half subject history and philosophy of science, which was a natural package to make up the total modules, we would call them these days, which, as you know, was a 2-year course, and I enjoyed that very much. But I wasn't really a terrifically good mathematician. I don't think I knew that till I got to Cambridge. I wasn't a particularly bad mathematician, but it became more and more clear that if one was really going to see one's way through physics at a higher level, one would be much better off being a really first-class mathematician, which I wasn't. And I was getting more and more interested in archaeology. I mentioned that I'd been on excavations as a schoolboy from quite an early age, from about the age of 14 or 15. Mr. Coles, whom I mentioned to you, had organised, he knew a lady at the Verulamium Museum who knew Shepherd Freer, or assisted Shepherd Freer, who was excavating at Canterbury. And he was a schoolmaster at that time, but a very fine excavator. So he agreed that I would be able to go and dig with him during the vacation for a couple of weeks at Easter and in the summer. And I did that for several seasons and just found that very fascinating to see the information emerging as you dig and be bringing it to light, literally. I found that great fun, and so I enjoyed excavating very much and read a little. I remember I subscribed to Antiquity quite near. I'm not sure that I read all that was in the journal, but I took an interest and so on. Then I, on a number of holidays, seen some fascinating places, and just gradually it began to dawn on me during, I suppose, the second of those 2 years in Cambridge, when I had to ask myself, what would I do after one more year when I went out into the world? I certainly wasn't going to do research on one particular organic compound and define all its propensities and properties, and that was going to be my contribution. Also, I think perhaps I saw some of the disadvantages of my father's lifestyle, in the sense that he was a successful director of ICI Plastics. He was sales director, so he was travelling around the world and enjoying it thoroughly, but he always just had a couple of hours to himself in this place or that place. So he saw some wonderful things, but in a very brief and therefore slightly superficial way. I didn't really see myself as becoming or seeking to become a captain of industry, and so I thought in the end archaeology might be something interesting to take more seriously. And as you know, in Cambridge it's amazingly easy to change subjects. You take part 1 of the tripos of the examination system, and then you can, if you wish, change to another. I was lucky because I was in St John's College, and in my first year I was on the same staircase as Glyn Daniel, who was a charming man as well as a very distinguished archaeologist, and already knew him casually, not well, but rather casually. And so when my tutor said, well, you ought to go and discuss this with Dr. Daniel, that was an easy thing to do. And he said, oh, the easiest thing in the world. And so I changed to archaeology and found that absorbing and without posing quite the same problems as to what one would do afterwards.
Was it a 2-year part 2 that you did then?
Yes, as you imply, normally one would finish after 3 years, but the suggestion was that because I had done natural science for 2 years, and we only needed to do 1 more year before the finals, and indeed actually the part 1 examination in natural sciences was sufficient qualification for the degree, so I did 2 years. It was suggested I should do 2 years archaeology, which was the 2-year part 2. But after 1 year, technically I was qualified for the BA because I'd taken part 1 natural sciences and had the 3-year qualification. But anyway, it was a 2-year course that I took part in, and very good fun it was.
Tell me about the teachers. I've had pen portraits of Cambridge anthropologists of that era, but not of the archaeologists. So Glyn was there.
Glyn Daniel, the professor was Graham Clark, and Glyn Daniel was one of the teachers. Charles McBurney was another, though I didn't see much of him because I wasn't doing the Paleolithic option, which was his thing. And John Coles was the lecturer. And there are 1 or 2 more. Eric Higgs was in the background doing supervisions, but he wasn't a lecturer. But John Coles, I think, was the person who did the brunt of the work in covering the Bronze Age. There were options, of course. I chose the N, B and I, Neolithic, Bronze and Iron. And John Coles certainly laid much of the groundwork of the course. And Glyn did most of the Neolithic, which he did very well, always stressing his own interests. We learnt a lot about the megaliths, which he put across with great charm. And Glyn, of course, was always up to date with news of the moment, because Glyn was the editor of Antiquity at that time. So some new article would have caught his attention, or some new radiocarbon date, and he'd come in and announce some new radiocarbon dates to us. So he was all very much up to the moment. But I think all the students at that time owed a great debt of gratitude to John Coles, who was, of course, younger than Graham Clark or Glyn Daniel, and I think a little bit more in touch with what the students really needed to pass their examinations and so on. And so he did a lot of the bread and butter teaching in a very systematic way.
Was he at St John's as well?
No, I think he may have been St Catherine's College, but he certainly wasn't at St John's.
I never quite, I envied, but was saddened when he took pretty early retirement, didn't he?
Yes, he did. Then he went down to
Somerset.
That's right, and then has had a very active academic career since then, also at Exeter, I think. But it was sad that he left Cambridge quite early on. I don't quite know why that was. But anyway, I think we owed him a great debt of gratitude. But Glyn always made everything interesting, partly by talking about the things that interested him, rather more than the curriculum sometimes. And supervisions with him were always delightful. And Glyn, of course, was really interested in people, so that the personalities of archaeology fascinated him and became very entertaining for everybody. He, of course, knew everybody in the archaeological world, doubly so through his work as editor of Antiquity, and so he'd have a little party in his rooms from time to time, a little drinks party on a Sunday morning, and so that's when I first met Sir Mortimer Wheeler and quite a lot of interesting people.
Was that, do you think, a contribution to your interest in the history of archaeology? I mean, Glyn wrote about the history of archaeology.
Yes. I think the history of archaeology, for me, is an interesting subject because of the growth of ideas. And archaeology, as you know as well as I do, is a slightly curious subject because it isn't clear what you should be studying, or it wasn't clear 2 centuries ago or 3 centuries how you'd find out about it. It's a subject that's had to construct its own theoretical framework just over the past century and a half, really, or 2 centuries. I think Glyn's book, The Idea of Prehistory, is one of the best books in archaeology that's ever been written. It's true that he did a longer history of archaeology, 100 years of archaeology, which was full of informative detail, but actually as an ideas book, The Idea of Prehistory, I think, is terrific. And there are lots of things about prehistory that are not obvious, and I'm sure lots of developments yet to come that are not obvious. I suppose it's true of most subjects, but it's a subject that its practitioners have had to invent, and it's been quite a difficult course doing so over those 150 years, I think. And so I think Glyn's thoughtfulness about that, I say thoughtfulness, and he really was thoughtful, say, about the 3-age system, although it always disappointed me and puzzled me a little that he wasn't thoughtful, I don't think, in quite the same way about our own time. He sort of opined early on that the so-called new archaeology was just a lot of verbiage from beginning to end, and never had any time for it at all, and wasn't really interested in the problems, or wasn't as expounded by so-called new archaeologists of the nature of explanation in archaeology, which was curious because his book, The Idea of Prehistory, is full of early examinations of what is the nature of explanation in archaeology. But I still think it's one of the best introductions to archaeology ever written.
It's ironical in a way then that he appointed, or must have been central to the appointment of one of the great new archaeologists, David Clarke.
I don't think Glyn was particularly central to that, because
they overlapped. I mean,
they overlapped certainly, but and I'm sure Glyn was encouraging to David Clarke early on, but David Clarke was very much a protege of Graham Clarke in the early years, and Graham and Glyn never got on very well, and in their later years didn't get on at all. Glyn used to tell the tale, and indeed many of Glyn's tales are very clearly set down in his wonderful autobiography, Some Small Harvest, and one of Graham Clarke's most interesting books was World Prehistory, which I think was in many ways a wonderful book, but Glyn narrated that he and Graham Clarke and Stuart Piggott had been approached, would they write together a volume on the basically world prehistory, and they'd had some discussion about this, and then the discussion had dropped away, and then suddenly Graham Clarke produced the book, which I think Glyn thought wasn't entirely appropriate, but they had very different styles. I've never really understood why they didn't get on. Graham Clarke's work was very tightly focused, and he probably had, I think, no very great admiration for Glyn as a scholar. Glyn, with his very broad range of interests, probably thought of Graham Clarke as being too narrowly focused. So though I think they were both terrific figures, they didn't get on, and people who knew the Danish scene used to compare them with Becker and Clint Jensen in Copenhagen. Clint Jensen being a bon viveur like Glyn, and always willing to have a good and rather gossipy conversation, and Becker being much more strictly focused on what he was focused upon. So that was one of the realities of the department in those days. And then Charles McBurney, whom I imagine you will have known.
I acted as secretary of the faculty board with Charles as chair. And you can
Well then you will have many a tale to tell. I didn't know Charles. Well, I got to know him later and liked him very well. He was, of course, a man of great enthusiasm, devoted, I think, exclusively to the Paleolithic period, which Graham Clark would see the point of, but Glyn less so. I don't know why, but McBurney and Glyn Daniel didn't get on terribly well together. And indeed, I'm not sure that McBurney and Clark were huge buddies. I mean, I think they got on constructively enough. But then into the picture came Eric Higgs, who was very much a protege of Graham Clark. Eric Higgs rather followed and developed the Clark line on the importance of environmental data, and Eric Higgs became completely focused on the subsistence base and sort of developed the view this was really all that mattered in archaeology. So there were really lots of differing views in the department, which I think I'd never quite known because I was only a student at the time, but I think really led to people really not talking to each other very much and being on not very good terms. Whereas in more recent times, when I came back to Cambridge as the Disney professor, Ian Hodder was already there, and we had lots of disagreements of a conceptual nature, because he was very much propagating what he considered to be post-processual archaeology, and I've always been happy to accept the label of being a processual archaeologist, and so I've never totally accepted the claims of the post-processual archaeologist to replace all former thinking, and of course differed in some of the content. They were essentially taking a rather in the early days anyway, a rather anti-scientific view, and though they were no doubt justified in some of the perhaps rather excessive scientism of the archaeology of the late 60s and early 70s, the so-called new archaeology or processual archaeology. The disparity, the dichotomy, the polarity was really, I think, quite unnecessary, and I found some of their claims, not so much Ian's, but some of his coterie, as you could call it, a little pretentious and certainly not entirely acceptable. But I mention all of that precisely because I've always got on very well with Ian, never had any difficulty in talking with him about anything, and we remain good friends, and I think some of that polarity is slightly diminished. So it's not as if we belong in different worlds, but the point is, even when we did have rather different views, it didn't lead to any fractious feelings, whereas I have the sense that there really were chills and froideurs and dissensions in the Department of Archaeology in the very late 50s, very early 60s, while I was an undergraduate student.
I mean, we may come back to him, but I mentioned David Clark earlier.
Yes.
I remember being on a train and someone talking to someone, and when I revealed I was in the archaeology and anthropology faculty, they said, "Oh, tell me about David Clark. He's one of the greatest archaeologists in the world." And I said, "I've never met him, never heard of him." Well, I'd heard of him, but I mean, I knew him just for the last year or two.
He was a very exciting person, and I think in some ways he was one of the greatest archaeologists in the world. Because I'd done national service, we were roughly the same age, I think, but because we'd done national service, I actually had some supervisions with him and found him very stimulating. He did, as a research student, to some extent keep himself to himself. Then he was developing his doctoral dissertation, his analysis of the beakers, which he was doing with a sort of computer seriation. And this was the very early days of computer applications in archaeology, so all of that was sort of seemed rather amazing. But his great contribution was his book, Analytical Archaeology, which was a really rather breathtakingly good book, because he'd had some good ideas about how archaeology should be systematized, how theory should be made explicit, but then he carried them through in a very systematic way, so that although his contemporary in the United States, Louis Binford, in some ways I think had deeper thinking about what he was doing, and wrote some articles which were the most influential articles in the new archaeology. Nobody ever produced a book of the same coherence and breadth as David Clarke's Analytical Archaeology. So that's why the comment on the train, I think, was sustained. It's true that he used a rather special vocabulary there, and this put a lot of people off. Jacquetta Hawkes, who was one of the great humanists of her generation, I think one can say, she wrote a very scathing review of Analytical Archaeology and said to read this was like walking on shingle on a beach, and she was altogether hostile, and Glynn took rather the same view, and it's true that the vocabulary could be regarded as a little pretentious, but I think it's a mistake to get too put off by vocabulary, and if one actually took the trouble, I think there was a glossary at the back of the book, but if one took the trouble to become familiar with 20 or so terms, and I used to, when I was teaching, afterwards when I was teaching, I used to have students do classes on unseen comprehension, and then doing their own essays, employing these jargons. It doesn't take very long to become totally at home in the jargon, and I think jargons are often a necessity in any developing study, so that I think is all slightly trivial, though it was an obstacle. But I think it was really one of the great archaeological books of the century.
Good. An earlier generation, but the person who in some ways almost most inspired Jack Goody was Gordon Childe. He often talks about reading his work and how it influenced him. What is your view of Gordon Childe's contribution?
It's very high indeed. I think he really was, for me, the most influential archaeologist of our time, though he died in 1957 or 58. But when I turned to archaeology seriously, in the sense when I'd finished part 1 natural sciences and so I want to do a crash reading course, I read most of the things that Childe had written, and he had very clear sense of problem very early on and set out to construct a way of reconstructing the past, piecing together the past, as he would call it, by using the concept of culture, which had a specific meaning, which he defined very clearly. And then he was interested, of course, in prehistoric migrations, and he traced his way of doing this. Then he wrote about the Indo-European languages. And then he wrote 2 wonderful books, still his best books, really. What Happened in History was one of those, where he took the whole business of the origins of civilization in the Near East, and then, as he saw it, the gradual spread of civilization to Europe, and put it all together in a coherent way. He was the person, as you know, who developed the concept of the agricultural revolution and the urban revolution, which, although they're paraphrased in different ways, are central really to archaeological thinking. So I really think he set many of the agendas. And of course, like many thinkers, he did go in different directions at different times. So you will often find, if you have an idea you want to go this way, you can often find lines of support in Child's writing, even though in the main he actually went the other way.
I mean, in the popular mind, or those who half know about him, they often characterise him as a Marxist. Or is it more a materialist, perhaps?
And now I think you would say it was only, well, not only, but he was a materialist. But since he definitely considered himself to be a Marxist, and said so, and since in those days, in the 50s, to proclaim that you were a Marxist meant that you were viewed definitely unfavourably in some quarters. He was a Marxist, but he had this complicated relationship with Marxism. I think he started off as a Marxist in Australia. He was the son of a clergyman, and obviously, though I don't know the details, didn't have a happy time at home. Then he was stigmatised as a Marxist in Australia, and this has been quite well documented. And that, I think, was his most active Marxist time. He actually had, John Mulvaney's documented how he had Secret Service reports written on him during the First World War and subsequently in Australia. Then he came to Britain and became established, got a job in Edinburgh as a professor, and then he became a member of the Athenaeum, and I think he's said, I of course didn't know him, but he's said to have enjoyed drinking a tankard of champagne in the Athenaeum while still being a Marxist. And then he became very disenchanted when he went to Russia. He became quite disenchanted with what was happening. But he remained a Marxist, but if you read the one or two articles in which he sets out his Marxist thought, I find it very difficult. I think most people today would find it difficult to find anything at all to disagree with. And I'm not a Marxist in the political sense at all. But I think the Child didn't really lay much emphasis on the class struggle, which of course is one part of Marxism that's very much... So he didn't have that sort of agonistic view of Marxism. So I think today I'd agree with you, I would see him as a materialist who called himself a Marxist. So, okay, he was. But there are Marxists today with whom one might well disagree, but I don't think Child would be one of them.
Excellent. Should we just quickly move on, because the tape's coming towards the end, but let's just get one more phase, and this is moving on to do your national service.
Right.
Was that the next stage after leaving?
Yes. I finished school, of course, then I went to Paris, as I told you, for 2 or 3 months, which I really enjoyed, and got to know the Louvre very well. I think I was unconsciously laying the foundations for a lot of archaeology, although I spent a lot of time going through the galleries of the left bank. I also went to the Palais de la Découverte and indeed, I went to some very interesting lectures. I heard Oppenheimer lecturing, and I've always tried, made a point of going to hear people who might be interesting people, even if they were going to be talking above one's head. I did hear Dirac lecture here in Cambridge.
What was he like?
He was very lucid, but he was essentially arguing to his formulae on the blackboard and really far above my head in what he was doing mathematically. So I didn't get a great deal out of that, except it's always, he had a quiet clarity which certainly came over very well. Oppenheimer, of course, and this was a public lecture, was much more easy to follow. But I also did something that I went to some seminars in the Sorbonne, which are of course open on advanced physics, and there was de Broglie, who was the Prince de Vogue, who wore a white wing collar like something out of the 1930s, which indeed he was. And I didn't learn anything from him, but I saw this great figure who was even earlier than Dirac slightly in the history of physics in the 1920s, I suppose. I think I've lost the thread of my argument there. We were talking about Paris, that's right, and so had a great time in Paris, and then went in to do national service.
So you did national service before Cambridge?
That's right.
I missed that, yes.
And I could have deferred it, and had I deferred it, it wouldn't have happened because it ceased being obligatory. But I thought it would probably be a good thing to get it over with. And I don't regret doing so, because after the first 3 months, which involved officer training, which was mainly on the Isle of Man, at Royal Air Force Derby, and that had its interests. And then I did some signals training, Royal Air Force Debden, and so did a little bit more physics there. And then I was stationed at Royal Air Force Wunstorf, and was very pleased to be stationed in Germany, so that I learnt some German and got to know Germany a little bit and Austria a little bit. And then I also did some teaching. I taught airmen who were also doing their national service mainly. I was able to teach them to do O-level physics, which seemed to be no great problem. And it went very well. The great thing was the class was very successful, and one of the nicest things I've done was to have a class of about 15 people all getting good grades in their O-level physics. And so that was an interesting time, had lots of good moments.
And not too many bad ones.
Well, I suppose quite a lot of rather dreary ones, but no terribly painful ones, I think. I managed to go down to Munich and sort of get slightly drunk in the Hofbräu house, and the same trip I went to Salzburg, and it happened to be the festival, and I managed to walk into a performance, or get a ticket for a performance of The Marriage of Figaro with Fischer-Dieskau and von Karajan conducting, Elizabeth Schwarzkopf singing, so that was all to the good. And that's when I first went to the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna and saw the wonderful Bruegel paintings and lots of other wonderful things. So, no, all that was good fun, and I enjoyed it, and so sort of came back refreshed.
And more mature, and you probably enjoyed Cambridge more because
I think so. I think a lot of people tended to just keep on the same trajectory, and it is hard work at school doing those exams, and it is hard work in Cambridge studying for those exams, so I think it was quite constructive to have a break.
Yep. Finish on your undergraduate period. Were there any friends from that undergraduate era that you still keep in touch with or have influenced you a lot?
Yes, I think there probably were. Most of them, well, I have some archaeologist friends I keep up with. Barry Cunliffe and I were in the same year, and so we've kept in contact, and we've never been hugely close, but we've been on lots of committees together. And
you succeeded him, didn't you?
In Southampton, that's right. And we've edited some books together, and we've always sort of been very constructive in many ways. Charles Hyam was in the same year, and now a professor in New Zealand, and so I've kept track of him. But most of my friends really I made in the Union Society, the debating society, as you know, where I really got involved at an early stage and found it the greatest fun. And so I made a number of good friends, one Tony Firth, who sadly died some years ago, but many of them have went on to do great political things, like Leon Britton, who's still a very close friend, who obviously became Home Secretary and so on. And then a whole series of other active political people like Michael Howard, Norman Lamont, John Gummer, Norman Fowler. All these, if anybody knows about conservative history of the 70s, 80s and 90s, they've all been very active people.
You knew them all at the Union?
That's right, yes. I got to know them all quite closely then. They were all really good friends then. And we've kept up in various ways since. We've often got together for dinner parties or that sort of thing. And it was Leon, actually. He was at that time seeking a seat as an MP, as they all were. Ken Clarke, I should have mentioned as well, who was one of the first to get a seat. And it was Leon whom I invited to a feast in St John's when I was a research fellow there after doing my doctoral dissertation. And I was then at Sheffield University, and a very safe Labour seat there, Sheffield Brightside, came up for a by-election. And Leon said to me, "Why don't you put your name in for that?" And it really hadn't occurred to me to do so. And so I went back, I thought about it, went back the next day and thought, why not? There wasn't, it would need a very big swing to get me elected, so it wasn't changing my whole career at a stroke, though it offered the conceivable possibility of doing so. So I put in, wrote to the chairman of the Constituency Association and had a phone call more or less the following day saying, because I was rather late in applying, saying they were having the first speeches of those who had put their names forward, and would I go down and speak. So I did so, and that went quite well, and would I come the next week? There would be just a short list of 2, and I spoke again, and then I was chosen to be the candidate in this by-election. And that was a great experience, but that put me more thoroughly into conservative politics than I had been. I'd been in the conservative group, CUCA, Cambridge University Conservative Association, while here, and so that really got me back into politics. And no doubt that's why many years later somebody thought that if they wanted a few more working peers on the Conservative side, this of course much more recently in 1991, when I was already at Jesus College, Master of Jesus, probably my name cropped up and they said, okay, we'll have him.
Well, we'll come back to that. Just
yes.
On the Union, how high up the hierarchy did you rise in the Union?
Oh, I became president, yes. Well, Union elections were a very competitive enterprise, and so one's paper speech for the term was always important, and partly it's amusing because it is competitive, certainly quite light-hearted, but also speeches on really interesting subjects. I think the Union was in many ways the most entertaining thing I did in Cambridge, and these friends I'm mentioning, I'm sure feel the same way, and for them, who became very adept politicians, it was an ideal training.
And did interesting people come down and speak who you met?
Yes, a whole series of people. In my term, I had some interesting debates, and one of the best was on the theme where science advances, religion recedes, and that was proposed by Fred Hoyle, who of course sort of crashed about in a very atheistic way, and was responded to in a much more subtle way by Joseph Needham. And you wouldn't necessarily think of Joseph Needham as a champion of religion, although perhaps when attacked you might. But I remember him very clearly saying, and rather charming us all by saying, he never felt the sense of the numinous more profoundly than in Taoist temples in China, and we all admired his deep experiences. And then my presidential debate was, the highlight was to have Lord Reith speaking. And Lord Reith has you and an older generation will remember, was a sort of legendary, monumental figure as essentially the founder of the BBC. And by that time, a lot of people thought he was dead. The Reith Lectures had already been established for many years after he'd retired from the BBC. But I'd come to know that he was active and invited him to speak, and he was terrific.
Fascinating. Were you a member of any other societies?
Yes, quite a lot. As I was a member of the Conservative Association, but I joined the History and Philosophy of Science Society, and he gave a talk there, and then the Fine Arts Society, and certainly the Physics Society, and
no secret societies.
No secret societies, no.
Except
that David Frost and I, and one or two friends, formed a dining club called the Cabal, which was by invitation only, and we had very elaborate dinners once a term in the Garden House Hotel. But it wasn't a secret. It certainly wasn't either the Pitt Club or the Bullingdon Club.
Or the Athenaeum. Not the Athenaeum, the Apostles or anything.
No.
I've had one or two apostles have come out on my interviews.
Oh really? They've come clean, have
yes,
they?
they talk about it now. I tell them there are 10 books with their names in it, so it's too late. Quentin Skinner, I think, was.
Oh, was he? I didn't know that.
Let's move on to your research, your PhD. Who was your supervisor for that?
Frank Stubbings, and Frank was the lecturer in pre-Hellenic archaeology, and I'd been on excavations in Greece at the site of Nea Nicomedia and enjoyed that very much. And in my last year as an undergraduate, I was looking round for a dissertation topic, and I'd seen in the National Museum in Athens a very impressive gallery of the early Cycladic culture, about which really rather little was known, and nothing much had been written for the past 30 or 40 years, and it seemed a sitting duck. And also lots of connections had been proposed between that and different parts of Europe that seemed rather sort of challenging. And so I thought that might be a good subject, and I wrote around to several people, just about all of whom very politely replied. These are people I didn't know very well, if at all. People like John Evans, who was the professor of European prehistory in London, and one or two others, and they wrote back saying yes, they thought this was a good subject. So that was the subject I chose.
And it worked well?
It did. First of all, it was an under-researched field, and secondly, and this really wasn't why I chose it, but it involved travelling in the Cycladic Islands, which are very beautiful in themselves, but they weren't much frequented by foreigners then, and so to travel in rural Greece anywhere is a pleasure, and in the Cyclades a great pleasure. So I got to know quite a lot of people. I began to learn some modern Greek, and really had some very good times there. And then the archaeology was very rich. I did a sort of site survey, not in the modern sense of walking up and down strips, but just going to places that might be interesting or were known to be interesting, and so found quite a lot of things. So it was very easy to put together a new culture sequence and try and do it more systematically than had been done before. And then the stories about the links with the Balkans or the links with Iberia. I had by then been to the Balkans. I'd done a research trip in the Balkans at the end of my last year as an undergraduate with some friends, so I knew some of the great sites like Koranovo in Bulgaria. And earlier, with my parents, I'd been on holidays to Iberia, and they were very patient, and if I wanted to go and see some megalithic tombs or something, inspired mainly by Glynn, then I'd been to Malta, so I knew quite a lot of the background, and it was therefore quite easy for me to see that the proposed links with the Cyclades didn't really add up to very much. If you really knew the Cycladic material well, which I had come to do, then the points of comparison were not really very close. So it was easy to write a broader conclusion questioning these supposed links
Seems to be. How does that fit into your later work? Because a lot of that is showing links and wide connections, and this is seems to be restricting connections in some way.
Well, you're right, but in fact, it led in very well as a preparation, because that was just the time that radiocarbon dating was coming into operation. Had of course been invented earlier. The first dates were in 1949, but it was only now that patterns of dates were coming through. And the radiocarbon dates in the Balkans or in Iberia or indeed in Britain were coming out much earlier than they ought to have done if the traditional chronologies, which Child mainly had set up, were right. And the sort of links Child was using were links between the Cyclades and Troy and the Balkans, or the Cyclades and Iberia. Not that he particularly stressed the Cyclades, but these were the sort of links that he'd used to build up the chronology of Europe. And I was coming to see that some of those links didn't really make very good sense, and said so clearly in that dissertation in 1965. But then when the calibration of radiocarbon dating came in, the tree ring calibration, which allowed radiocarbon dates to be re-evaluated, at that time the dates were set much earlier, so this exacerbated the dislocation, and I could see not only that the radiocarbon dates made sense, but I could see clearly that the old links, many of them weren't worth very much, and so I pointed that out. That was what I called the second radiocarbon revolution. And so that was my first my first proper book, was the Radiocarbon Revolution. And then after that it was possible to start establishing new links, but on a different basis, using a different chronology.
Radiocarbon, I mean, features in many descriptions of your work as one of your main interests and one of your main contributions. And why is it so important, the radiocarbon technology or techniques?
It is crucially important because until radiocarbon dating became available and then became improved through the calibration and through other technical advances, it was very difficult to date prehistoric cultures. Ultimately, the earliest reliable dates you have anywhere from historical means are back to around 3000 BC, using the Egyptian historical chronology. So you can't really date anything older than that unless you have some method, some broadly scientific method. And radiocarbon dating is by far the most useful. And of course it takes you much earlier, back to about 30 or 40,000 years ago. Before that you've got to rely on other radiometric methods like potassium argon dating, which have become available. So that really when radiocarbon dating came in, it allowed for the first time the possibility of establishing chronologies of different things in different parts of the world. For instance, in the Americas, where the historical chronologies, they weren't very well understood. There was a Maya chronology, but it wasn't very well understood until after radiocarbon dating was applied. So that it was really radiocarbon dating that made possible a book like Graham Clark's World Prehistory. It wasn't possible to have a coherent world prehistory until radiocarbon was established. So I think it was in many ways a turning point in archaeology, because until that time much of the energy of archaeologists had to go into establishing chronologies, which was often a thankless and difficult task. Then when radiocarbon came in, it still needs care, there are still points to argue about, but that solved the problem. And that meant that archaeologists could now talk about something else as their primary interest, other than just when was it and what the dating was. And so that was terrifically important. And though my own work, of course, I'm not a radiocarbon specialist, I don't do radiocarbon dates, but I did see, so far as Europe is concerned, how the old system didn't work, and how the radiocarbon dates could easily be made sense. To start with, there was a lot of argument, and there was a very distinguished scholar working in Germany, Vladimir Milojcic, who said the whole radiocarbon system doesn't work, it's leading to confusion and so on. That was because he was following the logic of the old chronology, the chronology that Child had helped to establish, which did have its logic, but in some places it just was plain wrong. It was making the wrong assumptions, like some of those links. So I was fortunate, I was a little bit pre-adapted, having studied some of these links in a slightly traditional way. When the radiocarbon dates then came in subsequently, I could see how the radiocarbon dates were to be believed, really, the revised radiocarbon dates, and how they made sense. So I could see that a new chronology was needed, and also a new approach to culture change, because that was what led on. If the old chronology, which implied diffusion, cultural diffusion from the Near East, the automatic diffusion of culture to sort of less enlightened lands in the north and west, barbarism, it was really the transformation, Child saw it, of barbarism to civilization through a process of diffusion. That no longer worked. So one had really still rather amazing questions. When you look at some of the stone monuments, so-called megalithic monuments of northwestern Europe, it seemed to beg a belief back in the late 60s or early 70s that those could be earlier than the pyramids. And yet they are, and that style of architecture got going long before anything comparable did in Egypt. And so not only is that surprising if you previously thought otherwise, but then it does offer you the problem, okay, well, what led people to do these things? What got them to be so clever, if clever they were in doing that? So it does require a new mode of thinking, and it does indeed require new ideas or fresh ideas about innovation. I mean, the same applies to metallurgy, whereas it was assumed that metallurgy diffused to Europe from the great halves of cultural progress in Sumer and Egypt. And then when it turned out that you had a really quite intense copper metallurgy in the Balkans in the 5th and 4th millennia BC, before you had really very much to talk of elsewhere, or so it seemed in the 60s and 70s, then one had to say, okay, how did metallurgy begin? And so it really opened up important questions as how do innovations arrive, and what makes for progress, if that's the word you want to use, in these areas. And indeed my own work in the Cyclades, the dissertation wasn't published, but it was John Coles who invited me some years later. He was doing a series with Methuen, the publisher. He asked me to do a volume, and by this time it wasn't going to be so much about the Cyclades, but about the emergence of civilization in the Aegean. And I called it The Emergence of Civilization, and the main theme really was that this is to be interpreted in Aegean terms, not as something that was diffused from the Near East. It wasn't so much just a chronological question as a broader question. And so a lot of those issues were all arose from or in relation to the radiocarbon revolution. Because if you've had that revolution, you really are looking for a new set of explanations. And so explanation was really the name of the game.
Lots of questions come out of that. One is you must have come up against the diffusionists. I see at one point I had some contact with the New Diffusionist magazine and the New Diffusionists, or the new... I think, were you one of their enemies?
Yes, one of their arch enemies, although I managed to stay on really fairly civil terms. I subscribed to the New Diffusionist and read to its pages with, still have one of the few scholars, I imagine, to have a complete series on my shelf somewhere of the New Diffusionist. And as you know very well, that was hyper-diffusionism of the old kind. meaning really following the ideas of Eliot Smith, that just about everything that happened started in Egypt or possibly in Sumer and diffused out to the rest of the world, so that if you have pyramids in Mesoamerica, they must be derived from the pyramids of Egypt, and so on. And they were really distinctly hyper, I think. My own scholarship, if that's the word, in diffusionism was more restricted to what happened in Europe, and it was possible, as I'm saying, to show that the diffusionist explanations did not work there, and then begin to suggest other explanations. But the New Diffusionist magazine and its exponents was certainly not content to speak only of Europe, but definitely took a pan-global vision, as you will remember.
I know. How is this all related to what is described as the Renfrew hypothesis, the view that a centre, we won't say the centre, a centre was in Anatolia?
In a way, it's almost the converse, because in terms of culture change, as we've just been saying, I've argued against any one preponderant centre, but that we have to look at culture change in local terms and local interactions. I developed the concept of peer-polity interaction, suggesting that if we look at in a particular area like the Aegean, and you have lots of local centres interacting and competing, out of that you can get quite a dynamic of culture change without having to look to some external origin beyond that. So that's a slightly different point from the Indo-European issue, because when you refer to the so-called, I didn't call it the Renfrew hypothesis, I think that's
Wikipedia calls it that.
That's, I think, because I've formed the view that I may be in error, that my Wikipedia entry, which I've never tried to correct, I think it was written by Jim Mallory, who is an enthusiastic Indo-Europeanist, and the clue that gives it away is when you get to the bottom of the page, links. There are one or two links, for instance, to college in Cambridge or indeed to the Union Society, but there's also a link to Jim Mallory, and I certainly didn't put that there, and so I wonder who did. It seems to me he possibly did. And because he's devoted much of his career to the Indo-European question, it's naturally at the forefront of his mind. But it came to me, I'd always been sceptical. I'd read Child's The Aryans, in that interesting reading summer I had just before I changed to, it must be the summer of 1960 I suppose, when I changed to archaeology, and Child's The Aryans was a book about the Indo-European languages, and I didn't really find it very persuasive at all. And then one of his last books in 1949 was Prehistoric Migrations in Europe, and that I found in very migrationist and diffusionist mode, and didn't really think that made very good sense. So when I came to study the prehistory of the Aegean, I kept on stubbing my toe against the circumstance that the Greeks, of course, speak and spoke an Indo-European language within the Indo-European language family, but it was generally understood there must have been a coming of the Greeks, and the advent of the Greeks, the coming of the Greeks, was a big event to be variously dated by various scholars, but I could never really understand the archaeological evidence for any major transformation at that time. But it was, of course, part of a wider story, which was the coming of the Indo-Europeans to Europe. And when you looked into it, there is this family of languages called Indo-European, and the linguists make a very plausible case that they're related, which very few people would doubt. They must probably have started somewhere. There are different models for linguistic origins. And so where would they start from? Well, there was this pre-existing idea which Child had promoted, that they all were great migrating warriors from north of the great steppe lands, north of the Black Sea, who came riding in on their horses and transforming Europe at different times, but generally more or less at the beginning of the Bronze Age. But none of this really worked out on more recent analysis. Horse riding is something that really seems quite recent in prehistory, maybe about 1000 or 1200 BC. Before that you get horses pulling chariots, but their first arrival in Greece was around 1600 BC. You see them in the shaft graves of Mycenae, and yet by the time I was looking into the Aegean, we'd already had the decipherment of Minoan Linear B by Ventris and Chadwick, and that established that the language spoken by the Mycenaeans in the late Bronze Age, around, well, I suppose 1400 BC, was Greek. So the business of horses and chariots just a little before that didn't seem to say much about the Greeks, certainly not about the Indo-Europeans. So I got very sceptical about this, and then I did an excavation on the island of Milos, at the site of Philokopi, where I had the good fortune to find a sanctuary, what seemed to be a religious site, though that itself has got theoretical problems. But anyway, in writing that up, it seemed to me logical to suggest that in the Aegean you have an evolution, if that's the word, a series of local transformations in religious beliefs as we infer them from the material record, from the iconography. You could take right back to the early farming period, the Neolithic period. You have a series of small changes, and then you have the flourishing at the time of the shrine around 1200 BC, and then continuity from there, despite the Dark Ages in between, to early Greece, archaic Greece, in 8th, 7th, 6th centuries BC. So I lectured about that in Oxford, and Professor Christopher Hawkes, who was one of the great figures, well, he said, "Oh, you can't say that, Professor Renfrew. What about Zeus? Zeus Pitar," and the Indo-Europeans, and he was pointing out that Zeus, Jupiter, Zeus Pitar, is an Indo-European concept, and so the Greeks were Indo-European speaking and therefore were Indo-Europeans, and so this idea of a continuity from the Neolithic through couldn't hold water because clearly the Greeks were Indo-Europeans and they must have come in at some time after the Neolithic. And that really sufficiently irritated me to feel that it required a systematic answer. And I had already much earlier suggested that in relation to the place names of the Aegean, which were supposed to be pre-Hellenic, I'd already suggested that the time that Indo-European speech came to the Aegean, to Greece, might have been with the first farmers, which is one time you do see a major influx of influence from Anatolia, maybe ultimately from the Near East, but from Anatolia, in the Aegean. So I decided to sit down and study this through. So I did what for me was a lot of background reading, tried to understand what was happening with all the different kind of tablets found at Bogaj-Köy, the Hittite capital Hittite and Attic and so on, and tried to put this out coherently and indeed essentially critique or demolish the idea of steppe nomads at the beginning of the early Bronze Age, around 3000 BC, bringing Indo-European speech to Europe. But if that wasn't acceptable, then I had to put something in its place. And the only big transformation in Europe as a whole that seemed to be on a sufficiently major scale was the coming of farming to Europe. So I just said, okay, let's imagine that the coming of farming to Europe brought Proto-Indo-European speech to Europe, which seemed a much better proposal, although nothing to confirm it particularly. And if Indo-European speech came to Europe with the coming of farming, then it must have come, the proximate source must have been Anatolia, and so that was the theory. That is the Renfrew hypothesis, as Jim Mallory, or whoever cares to call it in Wikipedia. So I tried to develop this idea, And it really turned out, I think, to make very good sense. So I wrote the book Archaeology and Language, which was initially not very well received by most linguists, mainly because they said the time scale, it's too early to have the coming of Indo-European speech to Europe from Anatolia around 7000 BC is just much earlier than could possibly be, and we as linguists have some understanding of the timing of these things. It's just too early. And so, but I found that if you ask them what is the basis of this understanding, they all, almost to a man or woman, reject glottochronology, which was a rather mechanistic relationship that had been suggested some years before. But they say, oh, well, we think about, for instance, we have a sense of when the Afro-Asiatic languages dispersed. But then if you look into when the Afro-Asiatic languages dispersed, and you ask those people, well, we have a sense of the timing, we compare it with when the Indo-European languages dispersed. So there were terrific circularities. And interestingly, more recently, much more recently, just about 3 years ago, Gray and Atkinson published a very interesting article in Nature, and these are really computer boffins and people who are interested in evolutionary phenomena. They're not particularly linguists, but they used existing linguistic data and some very good, I think certainly some very interesting quantitative methods to come up with a date for the first split in the Indo-European language family, and they compared it deliberately. They put on their diagram the traditional view as exemplified, for instance, by Maria Gimbutas, or indeed by Jim Mallory, and that was about sort of 3000 BC, and then the farming spread around 7000 BC, and just about all of their points, all of their data points, fell on the 7000 BC time frame. So I think linguists are beginning to take a little notice of that, but there is so much scholarship surrounding, I mean, there's a whole field of Indo-German, Indo-Germanistik, as the Germans call it, and they're very fond of it. So they're really not very willing to move away from that, but I've kept in touch with the subject. I haven't contributed very much to it other than organising some conferences on time depth in language change, and one recently on phylogenetic methods in language change. Anyway, that's the so-called Renfrew hypothesis, and though it certainly hasn't won the hearts of the majority of linguists, I don't think there's any better hypothesis for the spread of Indo-European in Europe, and certainly there are very few archaeologists who want to hear the hooves of the nomad horses pounding in 3000 BC, when horse riding wasn't a phenomenon in Europe at all.
Fascinating. Just to see if I've got it, the agricultural revolution occurs, the language changes because of a change in the mode of production in a certain area, and then the language spreads from that area, or does it?
It isn't quite that. It's that the farming revolution takes place probably at one or two locations that are in contact in the Near East. Then the most westerly region involved is southeast and central Anatolia. So you get farming taking place there. And the point is that the farming technology is inherently an expansive one. It's expansive for demographic reasons, that a typical hunter-gatherer population density in such an area, not necessarily a maritime area, which is more complicated, is perhaps 1 person per 10 square kilometres, whereas a straightforward farming economy in such an area, dry farming economy, will easily support a population of 10 persons per square kilometre. That's a change of a factor of 100, and that is the reason that I think farming economies often, not always, but often, are very expansive economies, and there's no doubt that farming did spread across Europe. Cavalli, Sforza and Ammerman formalised the demographic ideas, called it a wave of advance, And though that may be a slight oversimplification, I think their ideas are interesting and the emphasis on the demography is sound. So what that means is that whatever the language was of the economy that was now spreading, because it had become a farming economy, was spread across Europe. And therefore, that's the only reason that leads me to situate Proto-Indo-European in central Anatolia, because if you trace that, if you go back through time to where that movement essentially originated, it must have been central Anatolia.
Just finally, because I'm being very dense, it's the people spread rather than and carry the language. It's not that the people stay in the same place, but the technology is so much more efficient that other people in other areas pick up the technology with the language.
Both need to be considered very carefully, and there is definitely one school of thought relating to European prehistory that it was more the technology that was spread through contact, and that the population growth occurred in the existing populations that acquired the new technology, and so their population increased. But the beauty of the Amman Cavalli Sforza model is that they showed that if you have an exponential or indeed logistic growth rate, then even if you have only quite small movements of individuals, for example of 10 or 15 kilometers, but if what is motivating and powering the demographic increase is the acquisition of farming, then what you do get is a wave of advance that involves individuals moving not much more than 10 or 20 kilometers, but that it is indeed, if you're thinking about the ancestry or indeed the genes that are spreading, it is the genes of those who are initially speaking the language. Now, archaeogenetics has come into play a great deal, and it really is rather more complicated than that. There is some evidence to suggest in the male line, that seems to be the picture, with the female line with mitochondrial DNA, it's not clear at all, but I think you can have a slightly more sophisticated model if you imagine a group moving off, budding off, going 20 kilometers towards the northwest, and then that group who are speaking the Proto-Indo-European language, they admit 2 or 3 of the locals who are non-Indo-European speakers, and also have their own genes, which are not the genes of the first farmers. If those come into the group, the way language works, it's so robust that the language will be maintained as an entity, even though you don't have 100%, you only got 90% of the farming genes in that group. Then if you go on doing this several times over, the language is spreading, being carried across with the farming without very much change. But if it's 90% this time, then it's going to be 0.81% next step, and then 0.7%. So that by the time you've gone 10 or 15 steps down the line, the genes are going to be largely the genes of where you are, of the people, the Mesolithic people who are not farmers, but the language is going to be maintained as a fairly robust entity. And I think that's roughly what happened, and I think some of the archaeogenetics is rather supporting that.
Fascinating. Well, another 6 hours and we could get to the bottom of it, but or at least further down the tunnel. But let's come back to your personal life and your professional life outside alongside archaeology. One thing I'd like, of course, to talk about is your quite early marriage to Jane.
Yes, well, I was very fortunate in getting to know Jane in Cambridge. I was doing research. In fact, it was a romance made in the Haddon Library, you'll be glad to know.
Hooray! I'm sure they'll dramatise it one day.
I first met Jane in the Haddon when she was then an undergraduate, and I was by then, I think, in my final year as an undergraduate. So I invited her to accompany to the May Ball that year in St John's, where I was a student, and she came, and so we became very good friends. Then I went off to research in Greece mainly, and she came out on the excavations. She was already in the excavations at near Nicomedia, I may say, the second year there, so I got to know her better then. And then she came out to visit me in the Cyclades, and I proposed to her on the island of Naxos. And then by the final year of my first excavations on Saliagos, which was while I was still a research student, we got married that year, and so that was that early stage in our association. And then, of course, when we moved from Cambridge to Sheffield in 1965, we set up house there, and then we began to have a family and so on. And Jane, of course, had her own research which she was conducting as a botanist, and she, partly under the influence of Eric Higgs, had taken up what she came to call in her book paleoethnobotany, that's to say the study of plant food remains in prehistoric times, and she did a very elegant dissertation looking at carbonized grain samples from Greece and the Balkans, which we were able to collect on our travels, being given by museum curators and so on. And so I think she found it quite hard work as a married woman to complete the dissertation, but she got it finished, and so that continues to be her line of country. And as you know, she's now a fellow of Lucy Cavendish College. She was a lecturer in Sheffield, but then when I was invited to take the chair in Southampton, as so often happens with married couples, she didn't have a job in Southampton when we moved, and then our family got bigger, and so she didn't really look for one. But she's maintained her academic career with her publications and her work in Lucy Cavendish College.
She started her academic career very, very young. I mean, it's very unusual to find a 17, 18-year-old daughter of the Dean of Carlisle or whatever, I've got the details from memory, writing a very important, or editing an important diary, Antiquary on
Horseback. That's right. Well, that is a very nice story. She got very interested, clearly as a schoolgirl, and her father was then, he became Dean of Carlisle later, but he is and was a clergyman, and I think encouraged her to study the Machel papers, which were curated in the records at Carlisle, and she knew the area well and transcribed these and edited the papers, and so it's a really rather charming antiquarian book. And of course Glyn Daniel, who was always, as I said, like the personal view of things, he made a point of quoting from her book in one of his classes in the history of archaeology, and then it's not often he quotes from a pupil present in the class or something like that. So she was a little embarrassed by that, but also rather tickled. So you're right, she got off to a very early start indeed, with a book that is remains a rather distinguished contribution to the history of antiquarian studies in England.
Indeed, a classic. Sheffield, you didn't succeed in overturning the Labour majority, I presume?
No, it was a big swing. It was, I think it was a safe Labour seat, or reckoned to be, of 19,000 majority, and we reduced the majority to about 5,000. And there really seemed to be moments when, this was the Wilson years, when we might win the seat. And this led to a great deal of press interest. So the by-election was really quite exciting, because whereas in a general election you very rarely have a reporter at all in any one seat other than in London, but all the journalists came and we had a press conference every day, and I thought this was going to be exceedingly difficult because I wasn't briefed on every issue. I was reasonably informed, but I wasn't a specialist. And all these journalists are, of course, because it's their life to know every in and out of the political platforms. But it all went very well, and they weren't setting out to be difficult, they were just wanting a statement and so on. So that was really an exciting experience, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and it amazed me at the end that I'd, of course, prepared for a little. Then the campaign was 3 weeks, but the whole thing was sort of a 6-week enterprise, which is much less time than it takes to write an archaeological paper, which then is buried in the proceedings of the Prehistoric Society or something, and not read by a very large number of people. So I thought it very great fun, and then I was, after that, because the campaign had gone very well, it was suggested I should put in for 1 or 2 seats, which 1 or 2 of which would have been safe seats, but it was clear to me that if I were elected to a safe seat, then I really wouldn't be able to continue with the archaeology. It was clear to me that you couldn't do the politics on the side, and you couldn't really do the archaeology on the side. It might be different, as 1 or 2 economists or historians have been. If you were a professor of political theory, then you might be an MP successfully, but even that I think would be quite difficult. So I decided not to follow up the glittering prizes of British politics, but rather to stay in Sheffield University, which I was perfectly happy with.
This is just a personal question, but did you? My uncle was a Conservative MP for Cambridge for some years, Robert Rose James. Did you come across him at all?
Yes, well, I got to know him very well, and his wife, and liked him very much. I didn't get to know him at that time, but when we moved here to Cambridge in 1981, then we had friends in common. I think our Conservative friends put us in touch, and I thought he was a delightful person, and he was certainly one of the MPs, definitely at the scholarly end of the parliamentary spectrum.
He was also at the wet end of the parliamentary spectrum, and he revealed his feelings about Margaret Thatcher occasionally, and ended by leaving the party. But if you had to place yourself along that rather spurious spectrum, where would you? I mean, he was very liberal and
yes, I think I would put myself in the same area as he, really. I've known Michael Howard over the years very well, and debated lots of issues with him, and continue to do so, and I think I could safely say I've always placed myself well to the left of Michael Howard. I was having dinner with him just the other day, and he was assuring me how McCain was the right candidate in the American presidential election, and I'm not so sure of that. I think Obama might be my vote, were I voting in the election. Yes, I've always been, as indeed have a lot of my friends, somebody like Ken Clark, for instance. I've often seen eye to eye with him, and indeed I actually regret that the Conservative leadership didn't pass on to him. I have great respect and liking for Michael Howard, but I have more affinity with Ken Clark's policies, and that was a disappointment, I think, and a loss to British politics. I mean, it's still there, but he's very much a backbencher now.
Well, leaping over along that line to your time in the Lords, were you a working, as they call it, a working peer?
Yes, I was invited to be a working peer. This was in 1991, I think, when I was had already been Master of St. John's for some time.
Master of...
A Master of Jesus, I beg your pardon. Thank you for the correct one. I'd already been Master of Jesus for some time.
We'll have Robert Hound on our back.
I think he might raise an eyebrow on that. So I had this letter saying, would I consider being a working peer? Of course, very much honoured to receive such a letter from the Prime Minister, from Major. So I thought, well, what does this mean, really? And I tried to find out what is expected of a working peer. So I asked the Chief Whip, Richard Ryder, wrote to him and said, what does it mean to be a working peer? Can you explain this to me? What would I have to do? And they said, we think you'd have to be in Westminster 2 days a week. And at that time, I was Master of Jesus, and I was head of the Department of Archaeology. I didn't really see how I could do 2 days a week in Westminster. So I thought about it a lot, and actually wrote a letter saying out to the Prime Minister, saying I was deeply honoured, but I really felt, if that was what was required, that I just shouldn't take it on, couldn't do it properly. But then I had a phone call from Richard Ryder, and indeed one from Ken Clark, saying that there'd been some discussion, we think 1 day a week might be enough. And I thought, yes, well, I believe I can do 1 day a week. And because parliamentary business is only arranged a week or 10 days ahead of the present time, it was really necessary to choose a day which in parliamentary terms turned out to be Tuesday. So I started going, and generally since then have gone at least 1 day on a Tuesday. It's different if there's a 3-line whip, then which happens really very rarely, less often than once a year. Then you can drop everything and go and vote if that's the expectation. So that's what I did, and I found it a very interesting experience. Obviously it was a Conservative government at the time, and just about the first legislation I got involved in was the Higher Education Bill, when quite a few really rather silly things were being proposed that were widely felt to be restrictive of academic freedom. And so I got involved to start with, speaking quite often against the government rather than for the government on those specific issues. But that was very interesting, and the government did have to change its view on 1 or 2 important issues. Of course, there were a lot of people criticising it, and a lot of crossbenchers in particular. And then, since then, I've kept involved in some of the higher education debates. Certainly, the last time, I forget, 3 or 4 years ago, when Tessa Blackstone was passing through the Lords, conducting through the Lords, the then Higher Education Bill, I thought that was a pretty poor bill, and I said so in relation to a number of amendments, and was actually rather disappointed that there weren't a few Labour academic peers, because several who exist, they seem to be rather absent from the debates.
Lord Giddens was there? Or?
I think it was probably just before the time of Lord Giddens, but I don't remember Lord Eatwell making very substantial contributions to those debates, or giving a clear analysis of why things weren't working as well as they should have done. But a good deal of my debating and so on in the Lords has been in relation to the illicit antiquities trade, which I've rather taken against in recent years, and been involved in trying to raise the profile of that problem. But it's fair to say that since Labour came into power, there hasn't been the same pressure to be taking part in all the votes on the Conservative side. If you're in government, then you need all your peers to ensure that the governmental legislation gets through. If you're in opposition, everybody can choose their issue more selectively. So I haven't spent as much time in the Lords in the past few years as I did in the first 6 or 7 years from 1991.
Were you involved at all in this recent 42 days detention debate?
Yes, I was. I didn't speak in the debate, partly because the convention in the Lords is everybody who wants to speak can speak. So a simple debate on a simple issue can go on for hours and hours and hours. But I did vote on the first time, I was there present for the second reading, and then I was there just 10 days ago I wasn't planning to be. It wasn't actually a 3-line whip, but I had a telephone call from the whip's office, and I thought, yes, I really ought to go, because I thought the 42 days was outrageous, and it was a very good debate with, as you know, a lot of senior people in the security services, and the former Attorney General Lord Goldsmith, though he actually, I think, was overseas on the vote, but his views are known, and Lord Falconer, somebody whom I don't have deep admiration for, but at least he stood out against the 42 days, even though at an earlier stage, with different safeguards, as he explained, with lesser safeguards, with more safeguards maybe, he'd been in favour of the 90 days. So that was a little paradoxical. But yes, I did vote with the amendment and against the government there. And of course that was one of the good examples, I think, of how the Lords can be quite decisive, because the vote had been carried in the Commons, of course, as you know, after a lot of argy-bargy. But if it had gone back to the Commons, the government might have got it through again with a very strong 3-line whip, but it would have given the Commons a chance to think about it again, and the government was obviously going to have great difficulty getting it through the Commons, so they just thought it simpler to call it a day, and so that was one of the cases where the will of the Lords could prevail over the will of the Commons, although really I think only because the will of the Commons, if tested a second or third time, might have been found wanting.
So, due to time constraints, we'll move over the time as professor at Sheffield, then professor at Southampton.
I wasn't actually professor in Sheffield, I was
lecturer.
made reader, and then I was invited to go to Southampton, that's right.
Yep. And then, sadly but swiftly, move on to coming as Disney professor to Cambridge in 1981.
That's correct.
And you bumped up straight against my Professor Jack Goody, and
Yes.
I remember some stormy faculty boards then.
Yes, I'm not quite sure why we had what seemed to be rather an agonistic relationship, because Jack is a charming and interesting man. I think he must have felt it his duty in some way to maintain a position. I remember there was some, I forget, some small problem where what seemed to be some quibble was raised, and I was mildly dismissive of it and didn't think it was a serious matter. And I remember the response, "If that is your view, this is total war." And up to a point within academic limits, it did seem to be total war. Of course, it was a product of the faculty system that everybody is competing for resources, and so the two big departments, archaeology and social anthropology, then biological anthropology sort of doing its best, but rather in third place at that time. And so it did seem to me, I'm very fond of Jack now and get on with him perfectly well, but there were sort of occasional episodes of walking out and slamming doors and so on that always seemed to me just a shade histrionic.
Yes, I think it was partly inherited too, because they'd been going on these battles with Glyn before, so it was just a traditional kind of war.
It didn't seem terribly sort of cooperative atmosphere, although all the individuals were charming, and at that time I wasn't seeing much of Jack, but he was charming enough personally. But it was a rather strange world to be in, really, the world of the faculty board.
And I was chairing it, I remember.
And you were chairing it with great aplomb,
Well,
but it wouldn't be fair to say you were totally controlling it. I think.
it wouldn't. And then Ernest came. How did you get on with Ernest?
Very well.
Ernest Kelman, that is.
I thought he was a great man, and I wish I mean, I did know him quite well, but he had a seminar which he organised at LSE, which I used to go to sometimes, with the name just got out of my mind.
Hall?
Yes, that's right. Who was very bright, and I'd known him in Southampton, indeed. And Ernest was always interesting, but had a capacity to be acerbic, which he didn't deploy often enough in my presence. And I always enjoyed, just heard one or two set pieces. I remember one lecture he gave, it was in our South lecture room, so I'm not quite sure who it was to, but it was on the theme of psychoanalysis, and I thought it was a wonderful demolition, and a totally persuasive, and it wasn't demolishing everything, of course, but a totally persuasive demolition of some aspects of post-Freudian psychoanalysis, which said things and clarified things for me, and I wish I'd heard Ernest lecture more often. He did, of course, by invitation, lecture to archaeologists, and I invited him to things which he did. I thought he was terrific value, but I was just sorry that and he invited me to dinner and so on, we were good friends, but I was sorry really that I didn't have more interaction with him here in Cambridge. That's true, of course, of the whole archaeology department, though I haven't really thought about it deeply, but one of the missed opportunities, I think, of being in Cambridge, partly because we're all busy people, so I've been invited often enough to your seminars and so on, and haven't often had time to attend them, and I think probably one of the deficiencies in our system has been that although we're members of the same faculty, and it isn't just because of political tensions, those were not really all that important, I've not learned enough from Cambridge anthropology as I should have done.
Well, it's mutual.
It could be so.
Well, there's much more to be said about your place as a Disney professor, but perhaps one thing particularly you ought to touch on is the founding of the MacDonald Institute.
Well, that was a wonderful piece of good fortune for me. When I became Master of Jesus, I became more and more, or earlier, I became more and more clear that the resources available to the Department of Archaeology were lamentable. We had hardly any laboratories. We had that miserable little 1948 extension that Eric Higgs had used to work in. We had very poor resources. We seemed to have a lively school of PhD students, but nowhere for them to be. So something that I thought strongly needed to happen was to take that space, because the 1948 extension was, I think, just one floor, and build it up into a suite of laboratories. And indeed, I saw that there was the risk I might become Vice-Chancellor, because it was a 2-year thing, went circulating around the colleges, as you'll remember, and the system was changed mercifully so that it became a longer tenure, which made for better Vice-Chancellors, I think, but I might have been in line next along, or next but one, had it not changed, and I'd seen that something that really I ought to try and do for archaeology if I was Vice-Chancellor, try and bring about that to happen. But then I had this contact from somebody who said they were representing a wealthy person who would like to visit the department. They didn't mention who the wealthy person was. It was all very secretive, but it was clear that some good might come our way. So we organised a visit to the department and a nice lunch in Jesus College, and Dr. MacDonald rode up with his 2 advisors, and he was in his 80s, sort of rather brusque Scotsman, and took keen interest in a lot of things, very swiftly went round, oh, very interesting, thank you very much, and on to the next thing. And we got Paul Mellors and Joan Oates and Nicholas Postgate and a lot of interesting people in different fields in archaeology to meet him at lunch. And they had a very good conversation after lunch. He was interested in early man questions with Paul Mellors. And then he said, very interesting, thank you very much. And away he went. So I thought, well, don't get much out of that. And then about a fortnight later, I got a letter from the same advisor saying, well, we enjoyed our visit. I wonder if I and my colleague, not Dr. Mac, I and my colleague could call on you again. So I thought, well, we're not going to go through the lunch performance this time, so come and have a cup of coffee, which they did. And then they said it's been decided that Dr. MacDonald would like to give your department £100,000 a year for 5 years, would that be acceptable? So that was an easy question to answer. Then the next question was, how would you spend a larger sum? Now, that was clearly a good question, but I already had this concept in mind, and I said I could see that it might be a lot of money, so I said, well, really what we needed was an institute, which would mean premises, a building, which would allow us to do archaeology properly. And when I took that to the Secretary General of the faculty, it was very encouraging. I think they'd had a misfortune a couple of months previously when they'd lost some benefaction by not paying enough attention. So they jolly well did pay attention, but they pointed out if you get a building, you're going to have to get it endowed because the university is not going to pay to maintain your building. And so he was invited again and came, and it was getting near Christmas. The college choir came in and sang to him, and we did our best. And he then broadly decided that he would like to set up an institute, a MacDonald Institute, and we got costings. The Secretary General had been really very good. We got
was this Ken Edwards? Or?
It was, yes, and he did a terrific job in. He suggested we should get an architect in to do a draft design, which he or his department or his office paid for, so that we really had something to show Dr. Mac, and he liked it. And the costing was it would cost about £5 million to do the building, and I suggested £5 million for the endowment. This was before the university was taking such heavy overheads as it seems now to do. So that was broadly agreed, and though there were some thrills and spills and anxieties along the way, and planning permission refused, and then very sadly Dr. Mac died before it all came about. But we'd agreed on what a building should look like, and when the costings were done in detail, if really good materials are going to be used, it was going to cost 6 million, not 5 million, and he agreed to that, and so that all happened. And though very sadly he died, it was clear in his will, and it took a while to arrange, but it came about, and it has made a huge difference to the department, which now has decent base. And I'd suggested it should mainly be for graduate students, mainly because I thought we shouldn't be letting the university off the hook in what it should be doing to supply some facilities itself. Not that it's really done so, but the concept of it being for postgraduate work I think still makes sense.
Thank you. And you're the director at the moment of...
No, I was the director until, in fact, I was invited to write the statutes, and I ensured that the Disney professor was the director, but I overlooked, and perhaps there's no harm, I didn't stipulate that the Disney professor, when he retired, should still be the director. So the new Disney professor is the director, which indeed is...
You're a research fellow, senior research fellow.
I'm senior, which indeed is perfectly appropriate. I think it's a shame in some universities that people are tipped out when they reach retirement age, but I think it's right that they finish up as head of the department. I think it's time for a new head of department or director, and I do have an office there for which I'm grateful, so I have no complaints at all.
And just finally, on Jesus itself, the college, you were master for about 11 years, is
That's
that
right, yes.
Yes. Did you enjoy doing that?
Very much. I thought it was, it's a wonderful institution, a college, and Jesus is not too big a college, so Jane and I were able to get to know a lot of the students, and we really enjoyed student life and tried to take an interest. We got very involved with the rowing, which I'd never done as a student here myself, and with the music and with a lot of things, and really found it a very intense life and a very rewarding one. It obviously kept me back a bit from the archaeology, though I've tried to catch up with that since, but it was really very good fun. Had its difficulties. There are always some fellows who don't totally agree with the master, and so not everything went perfectly smoothly, but there were no disasters, and we had our quincentenary, so I had to lead the appeal where we built a new library, very beautiful library designed by Evans and Shalev, and all of that went really very well, and so it was an excellent decade for us.
Lovely. Well, I always feel that I must have missed quite a lot, but is there anything outstanding that I've missed that you would have liked to have talked about?
There are two things. One might be too long just for a tail end thing, which is sort of what I've been doing the past 4 or 5 years, getting involved with material engagement theory, but that may be just a little bit archaeological. But what we haven't spoken about at all is the art at Jesus College, which has been very good fun and was indeed part of that, although it continues.
Tell me something about that.
And I've always been interested in contemporary art, and when I was elected, we obviously moved from our house in Chaucer Road into the Master's Lodge, which is a very handsome building, though we rented the Chaucer Road house. And so we found ourselves with a lot of wall space, so I actually took out an additional mortgage, not a huge one, but a small additional mortgage on our house to have some ready money, partly to move in, although we were moving into a building that's in principle furnished, there were quite a lot of things to do, but also to buy some contemporary paintings. I already had a few, but I bought a very handsome painting by John Hoyland to go above the fireplace, and then got some handsome paintings by John Macfarlane. But then there were 1 or 2 fellows who were interested in sculpture, and we agreed to have a sculpture exhibition, which we called Sculpture in the Close, and we invited some distinguished sculptors to take part: Richard Long, Barry Flanagan, Denise de Cordova, 1 or 2 more. And that was really quite a success, so it happened again 2 years later, and gradually the college has built up a whole group of friends of the college who are really very distinguished sculptors. When we got our new library going, the senior bursar, John Killen, suggested we should follow the 1% rule, which is to assign 1% of the cost of the building to works of art, or a work of art. And that allowed us to do an important commission. And we'd had Anthony Gormley in one of our exhibitions the previous year with a beautiful work in the Fellows' Garden. So we asked him to do a sculpture for the top of the stairs. And so we have a very handsome Gormley work, Learning to See, there. And then Eduardo Paolozzi became a great friend of the college and gave us some wonderful things, gave us a wonderful set of prints in the computer room, Calcium Light Night, and a couple of sculptures. And then Barry Flanagan had loaned us from our first exhibition a bronze horse, a life-size bronze horse, which is in the first court, and that's on long-term loan to the college. And then when the Queen came for the opening, Barry Flanagan was there and had a bit of an altercation with the Chancellor, with Prince Philip, who thought there was something wrong with the ears of the horse, and Barry was quite tickled by this turn of events. And I had said to him later on that day how wonderful it would be if we could borrow the cricketer, which was very large cricketing hare, 18 feet tall, which had been exhibited at the Royal Academy summer show that year. Wouldn't it be nice if that was standing on the boundary of a cricket pitch, and could we borrow that? And so he smiled in his oblique way and said nothing. The following week I had a telephone call from Leslie Waddington, who was his dealer, saying that Barry had decided to give that work to the college. And we've had another very fine gift from Alison Wilding. Richard Long, for our quincentenary exhibition, did one of his mud works, River Avon mud hand circles, in the upper hall. And rather to my astonishment, the fellows all agreed that they would like to keep this work if it was possible, because we've always had a warm support among some of the fellows, but not among the totality of the fellows. Anyway, that was the view, and Richard Long was very happy that it should be kept. So we have a Richard Long work in the upper hall, and quite a few other interesting works. So that over the years, the college has established a nice link with a number of sculptures. We're having, we hope, quite a big exhibition next summer for the 800th anniversary of the university. We hope Anselm Kiefer may be one of the lenders, and Anthony Caro another, so that that continues, and somehow the college has got a reputation in the art world now. At the moment we've got wonderful work of 3 dinosaurs which are led by the Chapman brothers, great iron things, Jake and Dinos Chapman, so that's something that's developed a dynamic of its own, I think. Rod Mengham, who's the curator of works of art, is very interested and well connected. So I hope that's something that may continue and survive, and no bad thing to have some interest in the visual arts in Cambridge.
Lovely. Well, it fits with a recent interview I did with Anne Lonsdale, who talked a lot about the women's paintings.
That's right,
in
it's been a
Newhall.
great enterprise too,
Yeah.
that's right, yes.
Yeah. Well, it's a nice, positive, cheerful note to
I
end
think a
on.
positive note, good.
Thank you very much.